Well, hello. So this is the podcast Books in Sight, where we hopefully get a little bit of insight into books. We are your hosts, Ren, and
John.
and today's topic is going to be adaptation in a sort of broad, general sense. Before we get into that, because it is spooky season, at least as of time of recording, we thought we would give a sort of recommendation for the fall, spooky, autumn, Halloween season. Dee, did you want to go first?
Sure. Okay. My suggestion is Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Not a ghost story. It's a New England deviltry story. I don't know if have you ever read it, by the way?
No, I haven't, but I'm ready for the Nathaniel Hawthorne redemption arc because I was saying I really didn't like A Scarlet Letter, and so I've never read anything else by him.
Yeah. Well, this is a short story, so it's not going to take a lot of time.
Mm.
Um, and I don't, if you haven't even read it, I don't want to say anything about it really, but it's set in Puritan time, and it's not it's not in the sense of like anti-witchcraft by the Puritans. It's not that. It's more like just the devil is a real thing to these people, and something really weird happens because of
Huh.
that to young Goodman Brown, or with young Goodman Brown. But it's a complicated story. It requires some unpacking or discussion between two people who've read it. So
Okay, that's cool.
also, after you tell me yours, give it a little intro or whatever. I have a way to introduce the other topic through young Goodman Brown also.
That's hilarious because so do I.
Oh,
So it sounds like we're both ready for that because my recommendation for this is a little bit more on the nose, I think, than yours, and probably not as much to unpack, but still a sort of delightful seasonal read. The
okay.
Halloween Tree by Ray Bradbury.
Oh, yeah.
Because,
Oh, wait a minute. Oh, yeah.
well, so of course, Ray Bradbury is more famous for his science fiction stuff, right? I mean, he had The Martian, Chronicles, which I haven't
Right.
read, and The Illustrated Man, which I have.
Right. Okay.
But this is definitely middle grade fiction, which is definitely, from what I know, a departure from his usual
Yeah.
style and
Yeah.
even like audience. But
Yeah.
it's really delightful because it's this whimsical exploration of the history of Halloween. There is a plot involving eight friends, well, nine technically, but one of them is kind of not alive.
Okay.
And but eight friends trying to sort of save their ninth friend's life, and they meet not the devil exactly, but sort of the personification of death. And he takes them on this journey through the history of Halloween. And they also are trying to save their friend as well, which that sounds kind of silly. And it is not like complicated particularly, but it is very much in his style of writing. He didn't really amend his style for the subject matter or for the audience being like 12 or 13, 11-ish year olds or whatever. Like he still kept a very recognizable Bradbury style throughout this. And it's really obviously from the title, you can tell it's drenched in the atmosphere of the season. So in addition to being this kind of shallow exploration of the history of Halloween, which is a good place, I think, for anybody to start if they're kind of interested, especially if you have kids that age. But it's also just really well written because he's a good writer.
Yeah.
So even though it's middle grade fiction, it's a particularly good version of that. And the story itself, I think, is compelling enough to hold itself up. And I actually really enjoy it. I listened to the audiobook last year.
Hmm.
Which was just whatever the free audiobook on YouTube was. But the film adaptation for this, I think, might even be better than this is. And he narrates it. But we'll get into that with maybe the adaptation part, but it sounded like you also had an
Yeah,
adaptation.
I was going to say that is, I remember the video or the movie of that,
Yeah.
right? And when you mentioned the audiobook, just out of curiosity, was it verbatim
Yeah.
from your understanding of the book and the
As
audiobook?
far as I know, yeah, it was read by a woman. I think it was just, I don't even think it was an official audiobook, but it was a pretty good quality one. It was just, I didn't have the book with me at the time and I wanted to read it. So I just checked if there
Yeah.
was an audiobook, but I
Okay,
think
cool.
she just read it verbatim. Yeah.
Okay. Well, the other thing I was going to go into about Young Goodman Brown was
Yeah.
simply that I didn't know any of this until I was doing a little research
Mm.
about it or reading something, looking up online or whatever. It said in 1972, somebody made a short film of this story. In 1982, it was adapted for the CBC radio program Nightfall, CBC, you know.
Mhm.
In 2011, a playwright named Luke Kruger adapted the story for the stage, and it was produced by Northern Illinois University. In 2012, that play version was published. This is as far as all these wild variations. Then I don't remember the year, but a comic artist named Kate Beaton satirized the story in a series of comic strips from for her web comic Hark a Vagrant. And she focused on Goodman Brown's um, obsessive black and white morality and his hypocrisy toward his wife and friends, which occurs in the story. And there was also a Young Goodman Brown audiobook.
So it kind of ran the gamut then.
Yeah. So that's like about as much as you can do for,
Yeah.
you know,
I was going
and
to say the other one that I thought about recommending for something like an autumnal read, but it felt too obvious was The Headless Horseman.
oh yeah.
Or, sorry, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, I guess is the
Oh yeah,
original
right.
story, but
That's what I thought you meant, but I
yeah,
forgot
The
the
Legend of Sleepy Hollow, because I bet
yeah,
you that also is
yeah.
famous and popular enough still that it's been through all of those adaptations as well. I don't know about
Yeah, I
Sleepy.
bet you're right. It's also is that's also a he was a New Englander too, I imagine.
Yeah,
Western New England.
I'm very sure it's set on the East Coast. I've read it once. I don't know, although speaking of adaptation, I might have read some kids version of it,
Mhm.
possibly. But I certainly know the story and I've seen a couple of film adaptations, like a cartoon probably, and I've
Yeah,
definitely seen the
there
Johnny
is a
Depp one.
Disney cartoon of it that I
Hmm.
could picture, which leads me to that other question about the not pernicious, but
Hmm.
the almost inevitable blurring, like as soon as the concept of the movie version of Sleepy
Mhm.
Hollow, I go, oh yeah, there was a Disney version. I immediately picture all the stuff happening in that, which I think emphasized comedy more than the real story does.
Yeah.
Um, or the humor is subtler or more irony in the story than outright comedy. But the difficulty of getting that out of your head once you've seen a representation of something that didn't exist really, uh,
Mm.
fully like that
Mm.
in the reading. In the reading, you could go, you probably don't picture everything. You don't see how many buttons is he wearing a vest. They're vague, but they're specific to that reader based on the clues in the book, or they blow off some of the clues unintentionally and don't perceive something that they should have. Like, oh, I didn't realize the guy was missing a leg. Yeah, the author told you, but you know, but if you so anyway, I guess the issue in my mind that we're going to come back to, I'm sure, is
Hmm.
the the potential contamination of the original source primarily by a visualization of it.
Well, I think it's interesting you say that because one of the first ones I was going to bring up, purely because we're reading it for my book club right now, was Dracula by Bram
Oh,
Stoker.
okay.
Because I think that's one where I mean, obviously it's been read by a lot of people. It is a classic, horror novel. Um, I had actually not completely read it before. I got all the way up to probably the point in the book that I am right now, and then I gave up on it. I It's not my favorite, but I can also kind of understand why. I think the story itself is better than the sum of its parts, because I think as a novel, it it has some shortcomings that have been overcome by having been adapted into other mediums or just other forms of the story,
Right.
because it I wish I could tell you for sure. It feels like it was written serially. I don't think it was, but it feels like that a bit, because there are some parts that drag and are so long, and like are not even long as in like nothing happens, but just repetitious. Like if you kind of remember the story, there is this, I swear it might have been at like 50-page stretch of Lucy getting sick, getting better, getting sick, getting better, getting sick, getting better, dying. And now she's a vampire. And now she's dead
Okay.
again. And like that whole section is so repetitious. And similarly, like the whole section with Renfield is so repetitious. It's
Yeah.
like the exact same scene basically several times over. And it really slows the book down in terms of pacing. And it makes it such a slog to get through,
Yeah. I
considering that
didn't.
it's sort of exciting.
I never read Dracula,
Mm.
and I know you said it's an episode. It's epistolary,
Yeah, it is.
which I'm not a super fan of either.
No.
And that could be, there certainly can be an example where you'd go, a famous story, it's still in print, everybody's excited about it, but the movie doesn't take away. I mean, it may be the kind of story where it's almost better as a movie. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
Well, with this one, it's interesting. Yeah, sorry.
let me just want to throw in a candidate and say,
Yeah.
I've never read Silence of the Lambs by
Mm.
whoever wrote that. I forget his name. Um, but I don't think I ever will. I'm absolutely satisfied by the movie. I think the movie was
Mhm.
brilliant. And Anthony Hopkins was so incredible as the villain. And Jodie Foster was perfect as whatever her name is. But it isn't just that would, quote, contaminate my reading of the novel, but it's sort of like I don't feel any impulse to read the novel after seeing that movie. My feeling is like that was perfect. So I'm not against a movie version of a book. It's just that if the book is such that the experience of reading it cannot be replicated or improved on or whatever,
Yeah.
then I'm more, it's like if I read a book and I go, oh, there's a film of it, I feel kind of excited, like, wow, I'd like to see that. But it's never been a feeling of that was perfect. It's always a feeling of, well, I guess you couldn't expect it to really capture that book.
Yeah. Well, if you're cool with chasing that thread a little bit, because that was actually something that I was thinking about even up till this morning when I knew we were gonna be filming this, was yeah, because I get that feeling of excitement too, even though I know it's probably not going to be very good. And I kind of wanted to chase that thread a little bit of like, because there's such a push and pull between fans of things wanting and not wanting, especially a film or a serial adaptation of a book, and whether or not it can be as good as the book, or like, should you read the book before you watch a film? Like, there's just so much discourse around that. But I think that starting with where that spark of excitement comes from is kind of an interesting place to branch out from. So like, where for you do you think that comes from? Like, even knowing even that it's probably not going to be very good, you still feeling like, well, it would be cool if it were.
I think it's in a strange way. I'm not sure this is completely true or not, but my
Mm,
first thought was I want the novel to flourish.
mm,
I want the story, not just the plot, but I mean, this is great. I want it to be known.
mm,
Like say, White Teeth by Zadie Smith was never filmed, as far as I know. I would love to see that filmed. It seems like it would make a good film. And then it's almost as though, and then people will know they should be reading Zadie Smith. It's sort of
mm,
there's sort of a promotional angle to it, and
mm.
but that fits with me being disappointed after the fact because it probably is not going to lead to fabulous sales in Zadie Smith's novel, you know.
But it will lead to a really awful cover for the new edition.
Yes, that's another. I agree. I didn't even think of that issue, but I definitely would always choose the non-movie type copy of the book if I have the choice, because no matter how perfect those people seem, like let's say it's a Moby Dick or something, and you go, okay, here's Gregory, whatever his name is, who
Okay.
played it, Gregory Peck, I think. Gregory Peck played it. I don't know. Anyway, the modernism of having a movie star person on the front, the modern contemporary feeling is completely wrong for my sense of the book, almost always, you know.
To me, honestly, the problem with it is, and I suppose this even kind of fits into the adaptation app discussion as well, in a sense, because it's like you're taking a still from a movie and choosing a picture. So you're taking
Right,
something that was
right.
in motion and you're changing it to be a picture for the cover of a book to represent the story. And I honestly think that the problem with them, because I've been thinking about this recently, because I've been sorting all these books for the Rotary Club book sale.
Yeah, yeah.
And so we've been seeing all these books go through. And for me, it's less the idea of that being the problem and more how it's executed. I just don't think I've ever seen it executed well. And I don't think that that's because it can't be done, but I
Yeah,
think that it's just there's no effort into creating a cover. You know what I mean? Like you could
right,
take those actors, like what would stop you? I don't know what stops them from just doing a photograph for the cover with the actors.
right.
You know what I mean? I don't get it.
But I think that's part of my question mark about this
Mm,
is the feature will be, you know, like with Gone with the Wind or something, if they just showed a big mansion
mm,
in the distance and no people,
mm,
nobody would object who loved the book. But instead they would say Clark Gable and whatever
mm,
O'Hara, you know, it's sort of like, let me push into your face the Hollywood image of this. That's,
mm.
you know, that's why it's always going to be the people that are in the picture on the front. I'm almost,
Yeah.
because
Well, they could at
they're
least do it better, I guess,
no,
if they're gonna
I
do
agree.
it.
Well, and if they would consider maybe not even using the
Mm.
people, maybe
And just pulling a
you know,
still.
something from the movie that's, you know, like the car that they drove, or you know who.
Mm.
But
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point. I mean, I know that Stephen King famously did not like Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, but it is so beautifully shot that like you could pull almost any frame, especially like those really iconic moments from that film,
that's
you know, the
true. It's
twins in the hallway or something, and just put that as the
or
cover. I feel
even
like,
what's his name's face in the door,
yeah,
which I immediately thought of
yeah,
when watching that movie. I think
yeah,
they
yeah,
did
yeah.
use that on the cover of, maybe on the cover of the movie, I forget. But that, you know, that wouldn't be a weird choice,
No.
but they might just go like, well, wait a minute, he's not the only person in it. What about, you know, what's
Yeah,
his name?
I don't know. But I'm just thinking of like, I'm trying to salvage this idea, maybe not well, but like the other reason I think that I'm not as against it, maybe as you are, is I mean, I do tend to agree with your point about not wanting the image of those actors to be put into my head before I've read the book myself necessarily. But I also am really against book covers where they just, especially for classics, where they just, I swear, put some random image of a piece of art that's in the public domain or something on the cover of the
Oh,
book. And it doesn't really seem like it was thoughtfully picked. It just vaguely is reminiscent of something that happens in the book. Like, so this is a signet classic um, for Dostoevsky's The Idiot. Zero effort put into this cover.
yeah, yeah,
They were just like, oh, here's a detail of a painting of Russian churches. Dostoevsky is Russian. Boom,
right,
cover.
right, right. No, no point at all. As far as I
No,
can think of.
no.
There's,
And then, yeah.
there's I happen to have, I don't have all my fictions upstairs, but I happen to have these right here. Here's
Mm,
uh, Mrs. Dalloway with Vanessa Redgrave prominently
mm,
there, and then two other people kissing,
Yeah.
and then here's a more acceptable one to me.
Oh yeah.
It's sort of like a hint of the setting,
Mm.
like there's a lighthouse in the distance and some people on a beach, and it's sort of that's, appropriate for the story or whatever. But again, I don't know who the hell thinks of all these things. I mean, certainly this isn't the only issue in our uh, purview of what we're talking about here, but
Yeah.
now I hadn't even thought about that one of the cover art on novels. It's a very interesting example of and influencing having perhaps a benign or a pernicious influence on the reading of the book.
And I really think that that does fit into the topic too, because you are basically saying, I want you to transform this entire piece of work into a single image,
Yeah.
essentially.
Well,
And
it's like it's a little bit like choosing a title, but it's not up to the author to do it. Somebody else is imposing it. Very cool profession. Yeah,
yeah,
book covers. I mean, it's almost like that could have been a topic in its own, and I didn't even think of that at all in terms of all my thoughts on our subject.
noted.
Yeah.
Noted. Maybe next time. I also didn't really think about that when I was considering what I would consider adaptive or transformative ways to deal with fiction, but I think it really counts. I really do.
I didn't even think of that at all, but it's a very, very big, it's actually kind of a big issue since
Yeah.
it's out of your control. You go like, you say, oh, damn, I wanted to buy this book before they put out the damn movie copy. Now we have to try to hunt down the original look.
Yeah, and I'm not
And
gonna lie, like I not to belabor it because I do think this would make a good topic, but I'm getting to the point where I've been so disappointed with a lot of because I collect, I guess is the word, a lot of classics, and even the Penguin ones, you would think they would do better, but a lot of them, I really do feel like they just picked a piece of art that kind of was good enough to
yeah,
kind of connect to the story, and they were just like, we'll just put that on it, then that's fine, or something. So anyway, but I think that's one form of adaptation for sure that clearly even we think gets overlooked a little bit in terms of the impact that it has on the success maybe even of the book
yeah,
itself, or the at least the perception of the book by the person looking at it. It's really interesting actually.
yeah.
um
That's a really
but
bizarre subject because I
mm,
wonder if very many people, en masse would care the way we seem to both have opinions about this. You know what I mean? Like, oh yeah, I saw that movie. I'll read that book on my beach trip or something. And they're reminded
mm,
of the movie because they saw the cover, and then they're going like, whatever. I mean, I mean, maybe indifferently. Where to me, since I prized the book above the movie,
mm.
narrowly speaking, um, I'm more fussy about what was done to the cover. So
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I think actually just to wrap it back around to the movie issue. Oh, that was what I was gonna say actually about the Halloween tree
yeah,
is and why it is that there is a feeling of like, oh, I actually kind of want to see an adaptation. Um, I think that for me, it doesn't necessarily apply to this one because this I'll actually take in a different direction, but I think for me what it is almost like I liked the story so much. I wish I could read it for the first time again. I
yeah,
can't do that, but seeing it in another medium is the closest I can get to that desired experience of reading it for the first time again.
that's true.
Um, I think for me, that is really what it is. And I think that also, now that I'm thinking about it, is where my disappointment tends to come from because because it's not the book, it's not reading the book again for the first time, it's not it cannot function that way, but you kind of, or I kind of want it to, and so if it doesn't look the way I want it to from what I thought it should be, I already am like, oh, this isn't, I'm not really getting the same feeling from this as
Yeah,
I would have liked. With some exception, this is definitely one of them because I saw the cartoon adaptation long before I even knew it was a book.
right.
And it's such a good movie. Like
And is it,
it
did you say
made
it's
such a good point.
narrated by Bradbury?
Not only is it narrated by Bradbury, but Leonard
He's,
Nimoy is the voice
oh, the
of death.
eccentric man. Yeah.
Yeah, which he doesn't, I would never have known in a million years, except that I know that because he does a really interesting voice for that
Yeah.
character.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
it's a
that's cool.
really good one.
I was going to throw in a possible thought of
Mm,
it, I don't know for sure that this, I can't think of an example to prove this, but I'm suspicious that if I read a book that was really meaningful to me,
mm,
let's say a literary gem of some kind to me, and then I saw the movie, and then I reread the book, I think the movie would wash out
mm,
because I think the book would have a profundity of sorts, not meaning that
mm-hmm,
word, mean a deeper level, a deeper grab or hold on me that would exclude somebody else's version of it. And not that I would repeat my first reading, but I would be immersed again in a second reading and not be clouded by
mm,
the imagery, is my suspicion. Now, let's say Moby Dick. If you say, okay, picture something from Moby Dick, I'm going, well, there are a couple of things I could pick out that I think are in the book that aren't in the movie, but largely I would be picturing people that I've seen portraying the main characters in the movie. But if I
mm.
read the book, I think that would get out of my way and I'd be back in my version of the book. That's
I
just
think
my.
that's Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I was just gonna say, to an extent, I think it kind of comes down to whether the book, not always, but I think often more successful film adaptations are of books that were already plot driven, not
Yeah,
character driven in the first place.
right.
I think that's sort of almost a prerequisite in a way. Because I was just thinking back to Dracula about why I think it works so much better, in my opinion, in film format or cartoon or whatever. I mean, that's been done so many times, but I think that it's partially because it's an action story. And in some ways, and this might be controversial to say, but I think that it being a book gets in its way of its own
Yeah,
story,
yeah,
because I think the way Bram Stoker wrote it was using a lot of conventions of the day when it came to writing novels that don't really make sense for this story.
right.
Because, like, for
And
example, hmm?
the idea of it being a film off the bat wasn't a possibility. It,
No, right.
I
So,
mean,
but I
not
think,
that Bram Stoker would have said, "Well, I'd rather be a filmmaker than a novelist," but but you're right. He would have to use techniques that may uh, limit the value of the book as a book in the age of the potential of making a movie.
because, like, for example, and I hate to keep picking on it, so sorry if anybody's a huge fan of the like Lucy story section of this, but like that could have been done in a montage in a film in a way that would have gotten across how harrowing it is that she gets better, she gets sicker, she gets better, she gets sicker, she gets better, she gets sicker, she's dead. Like
Right,
it, in a montage form that would take like at most 3 minutes or something, you could have gotten that across. But for a book, that's 50 pages I now have to read of this.
right.
And like it drags in a way that in a
Yeah,
film that wouldn't drag. And like I find that really funny because usually I think in this discussion, people usually tend to land on the book is better.
yeah.
And I think that to an extent, and I don't mean to pick on this one, it's just I happen to be reading it right now, and it really struck me in the context of us talking about this, why it is that I think as a film this works a little better, or even just abridged versions of this story work a little bit better, because as a novel of its time, it drags. And it's not because
Well,
of the story, it's not because of the writing, it's the type of overwriting that he did, because I think that was just the expectation for
well,
how a book should be written.
my suspicion about I don't know about Frankenstein. That might have more literary
Yeah.
qualities, but in general, certain books um, like the fact that he invented this character
Yeah.
or gets credited with this character is what he's really done. And
Yeah.
and that character may be better suited for a film, which didn't even exist at the time, rather than to say it's a fantastic novel with insights galore. You go, no, he's created an incredible character. Same with Frankenstein, same with the Mummy, perhaps. I
Hmm.
mean, you could go, oh yeah, those are all great in film. I'm going, but my point is, there's a Sherlock Holmes is a fantastic character. I happen to enjoy reading those books. I don't think they're like the highest level of literature, but the creation of Sherlock Holmes is phenomenal and really enduring. And that's not surprising that there are film after film after film and book spin-offs or fan fiction, if you want to call it that,
Hmm.
using that character, because once he's been established, he's almost like an archetype for in our culture. And the same with all these horror characters. So they're bigger than their source. Whereas somebody could try to say Moby Dick is or Ahab is, and you go, I don't think he's gonna. He didn't make a transition like that. He remains a book,
Mm.
and they've made movies of it, but they haven't taken over the public, you imagination the way those other kinds of characters did, because that's what those people created more than they created a work of literature.
Well, and it's interesting because you can look at it in the other direction. I think that also helps kind of sink into why certain books make good movies and certain ones don't translate as well.
Right.
Like when you think of really big books that have never, not that they've never been adapted into film, but have never taken off the way that, for example, Dracula, the character, like, I mean, when you think of Dracula, you're thinking of the image of, is it Bela Lugosi?
Yeah, Bela Lugosi in American version, or the Nosferatu character.
Yeah. But I think when you say like vampire or you say Dracula, you're thinking of the Bela
Right.
Lugosi one, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
I and part of the reason why I think that is for all the things that I said, but also I think that it's interesting to think about sort of monster or gothic horror stories that didn't do that, where
Yeah.
there are film adaptations, but they're not the thing that took over the public consciousness.
Right.
A really clear one for me, really obvious that comes to my mind is The Picture of Dorian Gray. That's
Okay.
been adapted to film a couple of times, most recently, I think in 2009. But
Okay.
like when you say The Picture of Dorian Gray, people think of the book. They don't think of any specific film adaptation, I don't think.
Right. Right.
And I think that's not surprising that that would be the case because I just don't think that story is as easy to make a film out of
Well,
because
there's a couple of things. One, there's not an image that comes to mind of Dorian Gray. There might be of his painting, but in various versions. But I think it's on top of that, the writing of the book is spectacular or highly memorable,
yeah.
and they can sprinkle that through the movie, like, oh, some of the things these people say are right out of the book. I go, yeah, some of them are, but other ones are in service of your plot line. Whereas this book is just riddled with brilliant writing by Oscar Wilde.
And I think that is a big part of it. Now, I would agree with you that I think Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a more literary work than Dracula is, just in terms of the way it's written. But also, I think, again, the story she wrote is perfect for the medium that she wrote it or that she created it in. Like it's a very character driven story, the way she wrote it. And like I think that's part of the reason why, even though there is the iconic image of the monster that we got out of the film, it's not a film that endured in the same way that I think that Dracula adaptation does. Like
Yeah.
I've never met, I think, a person, not that this is like the be all end all, but I've never met a person who has seen that Frankenstein film or definitely be like, oh yeah, I've seen still images from that, even if the image of the monster perhaps comes from that film, the
Yeah.
cartoon sort of version. Whereas
Right.
with Dracula, I think even if you've never actually seen that Bela Lugosi adaptation of the book, the imagery from it is what's iconic, and even a person who's
Yeah.
never seen it would know what it was. or would recognize the stills of certain moments from that movie. And with
Right.
the picture of Dorian Gray, I suspect that probably what happened, as somebody who loves the book and has seen several of the film adaptations, um, I think that with that one, it's not only harder to adapt because I think it was also very well suited to the medium that it was created in, which was a book,
Yeah.
but also, and he tailored it to be a written thing, right? Like that's what it was for. Whereas with Dracula, I think Bram Stoker had an idea and writing it down was the only medium that really worked for that at the time, other than I guess doing a theater piece, perhaps. But like it was obviously like, oh, I have a story I want to tell, not necessarily a book I want to write. And with the picture of Dorian Gray as well, I think, and this is also something I want your opinion on in terms of adaptation, because I think this is also the crux of why so many fail when they're adapted to film, is or to any other medium, is if it's not really understood what is good about the original story.
That's an
You know what I
interesting.
mean? Or the or
Yeah.
the core of the story that makes it successful. Because with the picture of Dorian Gray, I think a big problem with the adaptations of it, at least the ones that I've seen, and particularly the more recent one with Colin Firth and Ben Barnes, is that they didn't really understand what makes the story work, not even just as a book, but just as a tale. For instance, I think it was a big miss that they didn't make Dorian blonde. And that seems so
Okay.
silly, like, oh, who cares? But that's actually central to what the book is talking about, which is that when we look at people who look a certain way, we can't imagine that they could ever be the bad guy.
Right. It's
And I
kind of an
think,
angelic thing, just like
yeah,
the guy in with the white hat and the bad guy with the black hat in a cowboy show. Yeah.
it really is that. And I think that people under appreciate how much that image still resonates that way. And as well, how that plays into not only the beauty standard, but thinking about the Eurocentric beauty standard, you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
And how that plays against the other, and the fact that you have otherized, racially otherized characters in that story that are played off of the Dorian Gray character being this very Eurocentric image of angelic beauty. And so by not understanding that that would work visually, I think you
Right. Yeah.
lose,
You would carry that um, contrasting issue
because that's
forward.
the part of that story that in a visual medium would work really well, is
Yeah.
having those types of visual cues that a book cannot do, even if it alludes to them, through words. and
Right.
and I think that that misunderstanding of the strengths that film would have to pull something out of that book are part of the reason why it was never very successful as a film.
Yeah. Maybe one of these days somebody will find a way to capture more of what happened in that way. Hey, you reminded me in some of what you were just saying that
Mm,
broadening it out a little bit.
mm,
I was talking to your mom about this subject of adaptation and all that, and in the course of that, something that hit me based on the conversation with her was like abridgments and Classics Illustrated and all these things that children or young readers get
mhm,
first time around. There's an issue that I hadn't really bargained on since I was my position. I thought my position was I'm against it all,
mm,
but uh, the cultural knowledge that we all carry, knowledge of stuff that we never actually properly studied or learned. You
yeah.
know what I mean? Like uh, the Epic of Gilgamesh or something. I happen to have that.
Oh yeah.
But what I really meant to say was, um, any let's say Dracula, we see the film. Somebody sees the film, so then you could say, "Oh, they've seen the film or they read the Classics Illustrated comic, so they think they know the work." That was my objection of like they're going to blow it off and say,
Mm,
"Why would I return to that? I read that when I was 7. I know that story about the whale
mhm,
and the guy and the ship and all that." And you go, "Yes, but it's also a cultural reference, just like
Mhm.
stuff in the Bible, that knowing about it is almost important to be part of this society, because at any moment that reference could occur and you're supposed to go with it and understand what was being said. So there's a weird value in accumulating the stuff of culture without necessarily studying all of the areas that it's coming from. We just kind of.
I think that's a really interesting point, and it actually is a good segue because I feel like we have not yet made an episode where one of us doesn't reference Lindsay Ellis, and here's this one. But like, but she did and it wasn't really about adaptation, but kind of in the vein of what you're talking about, where she did a video essay about Disney's Hercules, and which was kind of the direction I was going to take our conversation actually, in terms of adaptation. But the specific thing that I think connects to what you're talking about that she talks about in her video is there's this moment in the film, the cartoon, where young Hercules is at this temple of Zeus, and he's like down and out and sad or whatever. And he gets down on his knees to pray to the statue.
Okay.
And she points out that that is not what would have been done to worship gods in ancient Greece,
Right.
but that him doing that is visual shorthand for the audience because that's how they're used to seeing
A
worship being
worshipful
represented
position.
because of Christianity, right?
Right. Right.
And I thought that was kind of interesting because going back to what you're talking about, that is also the kind of thing that would be like, why would anybody think of that when they think of worship? Oh, because of the Bible. Oh, because the Bible is part of the cultural consciousness, even if you've never gone to church. If you
Right.
grow up in
Right.
a Christian, like Judeo Christian society, you kind of get those cultural pieces regardless. And those are
Right.
what help build our media that we build off of that. So that even in Disney's Hercules, that has nothing to do with the Bible, they know that it's easier for a person in our cultural context to understand what he's feeling and what he's trying to do by having
Right.
him do this on his knees in a temple for a god that we wouldn't be doing that for historically.
That's really true, but it also it cuts both ways, because it's like
Yes,
saying you're taught a false impression that ancient Romans knelt down to their gods.
right.
And even though it conveys the necessary information in the cartoon, it's also getting embedded as if, oh, everybody should be doing this. I mean, all the way back to ancient Rome, you go, no, actually, if they made a film and kept in mind that they needed the truth factor of whatever's going on, you go, but this is a cartoon for kids. I'm going, nevertheless, it will have this effect of
Mm-hmm.
reinforcing the feeling that that's how you worship. So it cuts both ways.
Yeah.
It serves a purpose that seems benign and quick and no big problem, but it could also be seen as reinforcing one way of seeing something that has many ways.
Well, and the reason I think as well that it builds into this conversation of adaptation is exactly that point. And that was sort of what I was saying with the picture of Dorian Gray thing, where I'm like, when you don't seem at least to understand the elements of the story that would be good film, sometimes you can even go in the other direction, like what you're talking about with this, and you just end up reinforcing incorrect ideas. So like for instance, by having the actor who's playing Dorian Gray be brunette,
Right, right,
like you're missing the point in terms of like what was trying to be said, and you're
right. And they
actually
might.
just reinforcing this idea that you can identify evil in a certain way. And same with this one is it does do what you're saying and reinforce an incorrect idea that there's only one way to worship. And to me, and this isn't the point why she was bringing it up, but I would say that's a failed adaptation unless you're just trying to reinforce certain aspects of the status quo.
right. Or you're oblivious and just think this is
Yeah.
shorthand. I don't have any philosophical issues in my mind at all. You know,
Yeah.
but on the example what was the example you just gave? Oh, the normal
Referring.
thing.
Yeah.
You might well pick like whoever handsome Harry of the moment in
Yeah.
Hollywood and say that's shorthand for this guy is super attractive, right? Because we all know he's the hot number in Hollywood,
Mm.
oblivious of the imperfection that that causes in the story. I mean, I'm just agreeing with you that
Yeah.
they picked the wrong. Either they didn't perceive what you're saying in the first place, or they're. It's just like the cover of the novel thing where they're going, "This is valuable for this extraneous reason," and I'm not even paying attention to the fact that it's disruptive or put, promoting the wrong insight or
Yeah.
failing to accomplish what the author wanted.
Which is interesting because I think generally speaking, the visuals of the actors portraying characters in adaptations of books usually doesn't really matter that much, you know?
Yeah,
But it was just funny to me that that is one particular instance where I actually think it does matter, and not matter like, oh, it needs to be true to the book for reasons that are not really well explored, but it's just sort of
for a explainable reason.
for a very explainable, easy to understand reason, and as well, the thing that would have made it as a visual medium successful was overlooked. And oh, I mean, not the only thing, obviously, but I think because I'm not going to lie to you, like I think Ben Barnes did a perfectly fine job at playing Dorian Gray. I think he was really good in it.
They
Colin
could have
Firth was
dyed
great
his
in it,
hair
but
blonde.
yeah, you know what I mean? Like I thought that was one of those things where it was a misunderstanding on the part of the screenplay writer, I guess, or the casting director or somebody didn't seem to understand what about the source material would make good film. And that
Right.
was one of the things that I think, because in the book, it's kind of easy to forget that that's how he looks
Yeah.
because you're reading a book. And unless you're
Right.
bringing that up all the time, which would be awkward,
Awkward.
you're
Yeah.
kind
Yeah.
of not going to necessarily, but a film would actually be able to portray that very easily.
Right. Well,
And
actually,
that would have
that
worked
yeah.
really well.
Well, I would say it's sort of like saying there are certain virtues in the visual medium,
Mm-hmm.
and there are certain virtues in the other one. Like
Mm-hmm.
avoiding being too specific is a much easier to do in a book than in a
Yes.
movie. But adding a specific thing that you don't want to have to harp on, is like I guess in a cheaper book, I just saw a real crappy thing, uh, Jack Reacher. When Tom
Oh.
Cruise played this character, and I didn't like
Mm-hmm.
that. And then they made a TV series. So they did this guy who's like 6'4" or 6'5", enormous, gigantic muscles, absurd. You know what I mean? So they can use that in this film where he can just walk up to somebody and it says everything you want it to say.
Yeah.
Their faces can communicate a whole lot. Maybe it's simplistic and
Mm.
not the most important thing, but it's just what the visual medium. In the other one, you have to go, he hefted his bulk, and you have to, use all these weird expressions to remind the reader
Mm-hmm.
of something. Whereas in the movie, it's just transparent. That
Yeah,
that
and as I say, this is the reason why I don't think it's not possible, and I've certainly seen it done very well. Like you mentioned, The Silence of the Lambs. I suspect that the reason The Silence of the Lambs is such a good movie, and a person could say, oh, it's because the director is good. And I'm like, or what we mean when we say the director was good is that the director understood what about that book would make a good movie.
right.
Similarly to the Bela Lugosi Dracula, I think that director understood what elements of that story made a good film. And it wasn't just, this is a popular book, or, oh, this is a good book. Because not every
Actually,
good book is going to make a
that's
good movie.
that's a perfect divide right there. I
Mm.
think if there's a book that's really popular, the most recent one that comes to mind is Where the Crawdads,
Oh,
something like
yeah.
that. Well, it's like as soon as that becomes a certain level of popularity, you go, I can smell a movie coming down on top of us, whether this book deserves to be made into a movie or not. You know, and and I think every once in a while they're going to make a movie of Great Gatsby, which they have done like 3 or 4 times. You know what I
Oh,
mean?
okay.
So I guess I'm just saying, you just said that expression of like the director understood what it was about this story that the director could conceive of a movie version that would be really good for the movie medium
Yeah.
versus just saying it's a popular book, make a movie.
Yeah, because
Get
I
your
when I
money
think
right
about
now.
yeah, well, because when I think about bad adaptations, I think what the problem is, and I hesitate to use this example because I feel like there are other ones that could be used, but like for instance, I think that the critique of the first two Harry Potter films was that they in some ways they I think it was a kind of an odd criticism, but I feel like it was that they followed the books too closely or
Oh,
something, and they didn't feel like a like cinematic really. They just felt more like a play or something. And
sounds familiar.
I kind of feel maybe even you said it. Maybe you're the one.
Oh, no, I didn't come up with this, but I think somebody did say that it took off when they changed directors or something.
Yeah, in the third one. And I completely think that the reason why was because when they shifted directors, the director of the third movie understood better which elements from the book would not only work on film, but would be strengthened by the film medium.
Yeah.
And instead of just saying, we'll film people acting out this
Yeah,
book,
we'll film page by page exactly what happens, you know.
or even just
Like what
filming
would
it
be
in a
different?
way that doesn't take advantage of film as a medium. Whereas the third one, not that the third Harry Potter movie is like, oh my God, like that's cinematic history. And like, no, it was just, it was obviously better for the fact that and it understood that it was a film,
Right,
you know,
right.
somehow in a way that
But
the other two didn't.
there probably was a feeling of this is a monumental cultural event, this Harry Potter
Yeah.
thing. And we have to be worshipfully accurate or we'll be ripped to shreds by
Mm.
the loving fans of it. So instead they just, let's be, let's be perfect and let's be, the other guy goes like, hey, it's a rip roaring fucking story. Let's do it. Like he had a film sense
Yeah.
of, we can really do something with this.
Yeah. And
I
it's
think
interesting.
that's a really interesting example.
Well, I was gonna even push it a little bit further and say like, what is the other big fantasy film adaptation series? The Lord of the Rings. And I
Okay.
think that those are pretty, not the Hobbit ones, but I think that the Lord of the Ring ones are pretty universally liked. It's
Yeah.
my understanding. I've seen them. I haven't read the books to be honest. Fantasy's not really my genre. But like, I think that they're pretty universally well liked, more or less, by fans of the books because I would assume having seen them and thinking that they're really good films, they must again have understood what aspects of those stories would be really cool that can't be done in a book that a film can do.
Right. Yeah.
And
So they
I
go
think
to
that's
New Zealand and you have landscape that looks
yeah.
incredible,
Yeah.
you know,
Like for
all kinds of
example, yeah, I wasn't even thinking about that, but yeah, for example, that or like and this is sort of a silly example and I don't even know if everybody would agree that this is true, but I just mean for example, like any of the magical elements of it that are visual, right?
right,
That
right.
can be done on a film in a film in a way that a book can only do to an extent, right?
Oh yeah. In fact, a parallel would be Star Wars
Yes.
with, like laser beams and spaceships and, crazy looking creatures, super visual
Yeah,
options.
probably wouldn't be good if somebody tried. Well, I assume it would be very difficult if you just tried to take that and adapt it into a book. You would have to understand what elements of Star Wars would make a good book, and it might
That,
not. You know what I mean?
that's
Because
a
I think it
that's
cuts
an
both ways. But
interesting exercise.
yeah,
Tell somebody take this book and take this movie and turn it into a story, and without the people being subject to this exercise, knowing the original book. You know what I
is
mean?
there a
Like,
book?
no, I'm just saying if there were
Oh,
something like, let's say there's a film of, Young Goodman Brown.
hmm.
So let's say, if it's short, like a 15-minute film or something like that, I don't know how many, and then show people that movie and say, I want you guys to write this as a short story for the class. and then
Mm.
see what I'm just going with your idea, which I think is really
Mhm.
clever. Like, what about going the other direction? What would happen if you took a movie that had all kinds of great movie qualities? Maybe it would make more sense if it was a movie that didn't even come from a book. But anyway, I just thought that'd be an interesting exercise.
Well, funny you should say that because I was gonna say fan fiction does that because it primarily, not exclusively, but primarily is taking a visual medium and turning it into a written
That's
story.
true. That's true.
But the reason why I'm mentioning that and I'm kind of laughing is, well, not only because I participate in this, but also because I I think that that is why fan fiction exists the way that it does to an extent, because I think it largely exists in the context of being an adaptation to stretching the definition of adaptation a little bit. It's more transformative, but like adapting something that was originally visual into something
Yeah.
that is not. And I know that that is actually, and it's funny because I know that's one of the big critiques of fan fiction by people is that it, like in terms of the technical aspects of it, is that it feels like there's a lot of dialogue in a way that in a written like in a novel it wouldn't people would be like where is like why is this just not a screenplay or why is this just not a
Right.
play
Right.
like why are you writing it like this
Because
and I
the writer is picturing these characters that already exist in a visual medium.
as are the readers, right? So you're
Yeah.
already invested in those characters and more importantly you already know what they look like and that's kind of the point.
Yeah.
But it's taking something where you felt like because I was going to add that part of the reason why I think fan fiction exists at all is because it's the result of people filling in gaps of missed opportunities or taking something that they felt like the even maybe author didn't understand about their own creation and making it better. I mean, to greater or lesser like degrees of success, but that is the point. Is
Enhancing.
enhancing. Like you feel like there was some missed opportunity with the original content that you want to improve upon in some way.
Right.
And that's sort
Right.
of the point. And I think hilariously, even though I know fan fiction is sort of contentious in terms of quality control or what people think of it or whatever, I think in a way it understands the point of adaptation better sometimes than filmmakers certainly do when it comes to adapting a book because with fan fiction the only reason it exists is because you understand what about it was good.
Yeah.
you know
There's a parallel thing to that.
mm,
Or it's like it could be called fan fiction, I guess, but the publishers are making a field day with this, which is something that bugs me. Um, I couldn't even I could I'm sure if you gave me a minute I could come up with
mm,
25 or 50 authors who are either have co-writers like James Patterson
mm,
or they're dead and somebody else keeps writing their books.
mm,
And the parallel to what you just said is it's the equivalent of fan fiction, you know, and there's nothing wrong with that intrinsically, except if and this I'm probably off. I probably this is my soapbox thing. If somebody takes Sherlock Holmes and writes a book, they're going to say, Sherlock Holmes springs back into life in the new novel by Don Powers,
mm,
not by Arthur Conan Doyle. He's dead. But these other ones, they're going, Clive Cussler, across the top,
yeah.
Pocahontas, I don't know, bombs away or something. And then at the bottom, it'll go, written by Don Powers. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
why is Clive Cussler's name up there? Well, it's a la Clive Cussler. I'm going, but you're marketing as though this dead man is still writing novels. Why couldn't it just be a new Brad Pitt, or his character's name is something like Brad Pitt. Dirk Pitt, that's it. A new Dirk Pitt novel, in the
Mm-hmm.
vein of Clive Cussler. But it shouldn't be looking like Clive Cussler wrote the book. And I'm not kidding. There are 50 of these floating around
Mm-hmm.
right now that are ongoing machines. So to me, that's unfair. And it should be like fan fiction, I'm not diminishing fan fiction. I'm just saying it is what it is. And that's what these things are. They're borrowing a character and extending their life beyond the dead author's ability.
It's interesting that you bring that up, actually, because I totally agreed with you until like 2 weeks ago. Because I'll send you the link to this, because you actually, I'll link it in the video too, but I can't believe you brought that up, because I just watched a video essay from Jack Edwards about this, where it's made me reconsider how I feel about it. I'm not sure where I land on it yet.
Well, but I would just add this. I'd say the publisher is pretending this is a brand. Like,
yes,
nobody cares if the original people who made Sugar Pops are dead or not.
Right.
The factory can continue making Sugar Pops.
That was sort of one of the points that he made, but I think the way he made it gave me pause a little bit, because he used as an example, in somewhat of a defense, I would say, of ghostwriting, the Hardy Boys.
Okay, and I'm very familiar with this.
Right. And how it was never, there is no that person was not a real person. It was always a group of people who then would take over the reins to be right. And so he was just making the point that it should be more transparent, because that wasn't even transparent. Even though somehow everybody kind of understood this, it wasn't like written by the writers collective under the name, like, that was presented as though this is a person. And he was making the point that it's really no different per se when you have these big names that get put on a book, but it's not really written. But he was pointing out that the reason there is a little bit of more transparency that should go into those projects versus the Hardy Boys thing is because this was a real person at one time.
Right. Here's what I would say. The Hardy Boys thing and Nancy Drew.
Yeah.
I think they might have both come out of this thing called the Stratemeyer. I forget the guy named Stratemeyer. Who would, he kind of might have an idea, like, I can picture this character and blah, 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 write it for me, And there was one particular guy who wrote a lot of the Hardy Boys ones, and he came out of the closet at some point and has a biography out about his experience with that. But in my mind, the difference is the Hardy Boy one, it's a little bit of a lie, but these are kids' books. It's probably like the kind of romances that are always the exact size as each other, like 119 pages or something every time.
Yeah.
And they go into a little rack that fits just those. That's no different probably. But with the Cussler and Robert Parker, and there's a whole shitload of these people, it is deceptive, because that person was considered important as an author of their own, presumably, if that's not a lie to begin with. And now that they're dead, it's like, well, this other guy who was sort of an assistant to him doesn't have the cachet of Clive Cussler. So why don't we just keep acting as though Clive Cussler is behind us? I'm going, if you wanted to say Clive Cussler brand, meaning books very similar to what Clive Cussler wrote by non-entities, that would, you could try that. But the other issues, one last point.
Yeah.
Would be like, how would adults feel if they were told, oh, this is like your kids reading the Hardy Boys. You're reading the James Patterson, fake author
brand.
Brand. And they're going like, no, I'm not, I wouldn't tolerate that. That would make me seem like I was just, eating Sugar Pops all day. Well, you are.
Yeah, I like I said, I encourage you to listen to his argument about it, not because I think it'll change your mind, but I think it definitely expanded the way I thought about that issue. Yeah, just like because because he did some research about different aspects of this, and he presents it in some, I think, kind of nuanced ways that even if you didn't agree with all of it, you would probably think something about it. Right. Because like I said, up until I saw that about 2 weeks ago that he put out, I would have totally agreed with what you're saying and wouldn't have even thought of anything different of it. But I think that he does make some points that either would reinforce what you already think, and you'd be like, no, I disagree. And in fact, what he said about it makes me agree with myself more. Or you might think, well, I guess I still think what I think, but maybe I think differently about this aspect of it, or I don't like this, but I agree with it, kind of. Because he
Yeah, no,
also makes the point
I'm open
about
to that.
celebrity memoirs.
No, I could be open to that. I
Yeah.
even discussing this our topic with your
Mm,
mom, altered some of my thinking because she spoke as a teacher and about
yeah.
how to react to things and all that. Um,
Well, I was going to say, going back to that, one other thing that I specifically, unless you had like some specific point you were going to
no,
make.
I was going to make a left-hand turn, so go
Oh,
ahead.
yeah, go ahead and make your left-hand turn then, because I was too.
Okay, well, this is just on the topic of our original
Yeah.
podcast plan, which everything we're talking about, I think, does touch on it.
Yeah.
Here, here's something I just think would raise an issue that's
Mm,
at the heart of some of this. Um, I'm reading a book called From Shakespeare to Existentialism by a guy named Walter Kaufman, and he's critiquing a book by Karl Popper. This gets too into the weeds. To synopsize the
yeah.
issue, is that this is very
Mm,
valuable for this kind of issue. He said I think he invented the term quilt quotation. I'd never heard it before.
oh.
And he said a quilt quotation is when he said normally if you're reading a quotation from somebody and it says da 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 dot 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 and then
Mhm.
continues, he said somebody edited the quote for simple continuity and took out some stuff that would have just lengthened it
Mhm.
unnecessarily. Um, and we're trusting that the continuity of meaning has not been jeopardized. So
Mhm.
he's saying Popper and other people have done this. He said, we'll take part of a quotation, dot, 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 stitch in something else that's nothing to do with this direct relationship and continue. And then Kaufman, to show his point, gives a quilted quotation from the Bible, from the New Testament, making the New Testament sound bloodthirsty and bizarre. And he's going, that doesn't really sit well with you, does it? Because it's not a fair representation of what was actually said. So
Mhm.
to me, that's an issue related to our subject because abridgment and adaptation run the risk of falsely representing something that they're not doing an adequate job of.
Certainly. And I think that actually directly goes into what I was saying. We're on a wavelength because that
We
what
could be
I was going to
related.
bring up. No, I almost. But what I was going to bring up actually was very, very closely connected to this idea, which is taking, for example, I think this happens quite a lot, and it's very popular right now specifically, but taking Greek myths or myths and writing something with that as a modern
Yeah,
author and wrapping a
right.
novel or a film or a series or something around it. So you've got like the Percy Jackson series wraps itself around Greek mythology. The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller obviously like draws from not Greek mythology, but like ancient Greek storytelling, right?
Yeah,
So I think that definitely connects to what you're talking about because if depending on how you do that, you may or may not be representing the story correctly in terms of its original context. Like I think we both agree, for example, that it was a bit of a lazy misplay in the Hercules Disney cartoon to
yeah,
have him praying like that because you could have used it as an opportunity to not raise awareness of it's not like cancer or something, but like to make people the viewers aware that there might be another way to represent that idea.
right.
But I think that it is an interesting question because it's like, to what degree is that adapting a specific story versus branching away from that to make sense of a new context? Now, I understand that's not the point of the quote you were reading, which was like how people can misrepresent through adaptation and original, I guess, text. But
Right.
I would complicate that by adding that maybe that's not always the point. You know what I mean? Like the Percy Jackson series wasn't trying to introduce necessarily kids to the correct or original Greek
Right.
stories. It was
Right.
using that world as a springboard to tell totally different stories, even
Right.
though that muddies certain representations of certain original Greek mythic
True,
character.
and I think he was trying to exercise a certain humor and creativity
Yeah.
in finding a modern avenue for the different aspects of the classical,
Hmm.
like another thing. There was a TV series from Gaiman. What's it? Somebody Gaiman, I forget.
Oh, Neil Gaiman. Are you talking about
Neil
Good
Gaiman. Yeah,
Omens?
American Gods.
Oh,
Did you ever?
American Gods. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've read the book and I've seen most of the series.
Okay, well, we watched 2 or 3 seasons of the series, but we didn't watch the whole
Mm.
thing. But in the concept of the newer gods, there was a very creative use of like television screens and electricity or something, to
Hmm.
show like how you could bend or manipulate contemporary
Hmm.
something to serve as the attributes or the power of a modern version of mythology.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? I think it was very creative to do that, and then also bring into the present gods from the past who are now just bumbling around, seemingly not the heroic, berobed and whatever
Hmm.
floating around. It was very clever, I thought,
I
by Gaiman.
agree. Yeah.
So yeah, there are ways to do that, and I think Riordan deserves the credit for introducing the concept of mythology and ancient lore to kids who might pursue that beyond his books once they've read them. Finnegan was interested. Of
Oh
course,
yeah, he really liked them. And I well, the reason I'm bringing it up sort of is to say somewhat contrary to the well, I mean, it's not contrary to, but sort of sideways from the point that of the quote that you were talking about. But I would say like sometimes changing the story is the point. Sometimes like misrepresenting the original is the point, I guess. Like not in a nefarious sense, but in the sense that like maybe the original isn't relevant anymore, or it's not relevant to the point you want to make with it. Like with the reason I'm bringing this up is because to be fair, I didn't even really like this that much, as you know, but I think that when Madeline Miller sat down to write the Song of Achilles, she was thinking, I think there are aspects of this original story that are not relevant anymore, or are even damaging or problematic, in our modern understanding of things like masculinity and warfare and things like that. And so she was saying like, I see something in the original story that could actually be reworked to tell a more modern tale. And like I said, there I had issues with her book that had nothing to do with the adaptive part of it, which I think was successful. I guess is my point. Is that like in some ways she's not saying we should throw out the Iliad, but she's saying like, you know, maybe this age needs a different version of Achilles. Maybe that we just don't need that version anymore. Maybe that's not
my
relevant now.
yeah, my question mark would be, um, a, a sad but true thing is the winners of a war write the history books,
Yeah.
and so in the course of time, women and minorities and all kinds of situations have been bad for people that shouldn't have been bad for since the beginning of history or whatever,
Yeah.
since Adam and Eve, for that matter. But anyway, I guess my point is, I like people going back and trying to unearth. Well, here's a simple example. There's a
Mm.
woman named something off Clint. I can't think of her first name, but it's a whatever culture. It's like her middle part is AF
Mm-hmm.
something space AF space Clint, KLINT, not
Uh,
like she's an
uh-huh.
artist, and she's kind of made a big splash recently. I mean, she's dead, but
Yeah.
big splash was bringing her forward and saying she was creating abstract art before anyone else we know of, before Kandinsky, blah blah blah. So
Mm-hmm.
they're trying to resurrect a fact that was overlooked, to correct history. So and I mean, you could say, well, it's going to be hard going to find a woman who ran a country back then, or that's
Yeah.
true. But I'm a little uncomfortable about the idea of saying let's pretend history was otherwise and
I
insert a happy thing or a better thing. There's a lot of movies set in Victorian era or
mm,
whatever it is with a black man as the hero.
mm,
And I'm my history isn't that super duper. I would I would love to see a true representation of when those kinds of circumstances occurred. They're very valuable to help redress an imbalance, but
yeah.
I don't want them to be fake. You see what I'm
Okay,
saying?
so yeah, I do understand what you're saying, and I think we can draw a distinction between these two things because I think we're not quite talking about the same thing. Because I 1,000% agree with you and what you're talking about with this, because it's untrue of those certain circumstances, and I think that as you said, it would be really valuable actually to adapt history more faithfully onto film in that sense. It was kind of similar actually to a critique, speaking of adaptation, that is relevant to what you're saying. I think I've told you about this before, but I think we've talked about this on the podcast before, but there was this person on Tumblr who was critiquing the critique of making Spider-Man, no, not Spider-Man, Batman. I guess there was some discussion of making of casting Batman with a black actor or making a cartoon where he was black or something. And she
Right.
was talking about, and I believe I mean, it wouldn't matter really for her point, but I think she was black writing about this. And she was saying, I think that would be really cool as long as they don't just slap a darker coat of paint on a white character, not because that is inherently bad, but because things about that character would have to change to make
Right.
sense of this new identity. She's like, what would it mean for this rich businessman to be black? How would that change his interactions with the society that he exists within? Because we know that that makes a difference. And that could be really interesting, but you would have to change the story to be a black story, which would
Right. The
make it different,
background
which
of
is
this character. Right. Yeah.
right. So, but what I think is not what I'm talking about when I talk about like Madeline Miller. And again, I'm not dying on the hill of that book because I had issues with it, but like that actually had to do with the way she adapted it. But like, I think those types of things exist not to erase the originals, but in fact to kind of build on top of them because, like you were saying, or I guess mom said or something, we have this kind of general cultural consciousness that the Iliad exists within, even though if you asked 100 people, depending on how you pulled them, I don't even know how many of them would have read the Iliad or what even version of the Iliad that would have read if you want to get into translation as a form of adaptation. But like they kind of know that story somewhat, somehow, the story of
Yeah.
Troy,
There's
right?
a cultural element to that story that's part of our cultural heritage or whatever.
Correct. Yeah, cultural heritage. That's the word I'm looking for. So thank you. And I think that when we see adaptations like that and the popularity of this, like right now, there's this renaissance sort of an interest in Greek myths, but being retold by modern authors. I
Right.
think there's this misunderstanding somewhat of what of like what they're doing. Because a lot of them, for instance, not the Song of Achilles because of what it is, but there are others, and even her other famous popular book, Circe, does this, but they're taking female characters from Greek mythology and centering them as the
Right.
main character, as opposed to the context of their original stories where they would have been like side characters or just not fully like fleshed out or
Right.
just kind of
Right.
existing for plot devices. And I think that's really interesting because I think a lot of the blowback against those by some people is this idea that it's sort of being PC or it's like woke or it's erasing or critiquing or like trying to take away the originals. And I'm like, I think they're just, they exist side by side. But I think what they are, the reason they're popular and the reason I think so many people feel spoken to by them is because they do like the story. They just don't necessarily see themselves in that original story, or more to the point of like what the worth of something like this is, they're just pulling something else out of it. I don't think you would write a story like that if you didn't have an immense amount of love and respect for where it came from. But I think they see, it's sort of like what I was saying, is like, what does each medium do well? If you want to consider, which some people might not, something like The Song of Achilles or Circe by Madeline Miller as fan fiction, what does fan fiction do well as a medium that can be a strength? What can you do with it that makes a story stronger in that medium? And I think one of the things that it does well, that is a good thing to do with it in this medium, is its ability to pull small threads out of things and make them bigger and make them the focus. And in that way, I see them as enhancing original texts, not necessarily existing as a means of getting rid of them.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess you would be on, let's say you're in a, I guess if yeah, I don't have any objection to that, but I guess I'm not sure where that stands in, like, if you're studying ancient Greece, you're going to be in a culture where slaves exist and women are secondary characters, I presume. I'm no expert in that area.
And that's what I'm trying to say, is that I
reality,
think for something to be considered a good adaptation, like we talked about, I think there has to be truthful elements to it, but also keeping in mind the strength of the medium. So like, for instance, in the Song of Achilles, and I wish I could think of or had read some of these other ones that might be better than that one. I don't really like that one that much. I think it's fine, but I don't think it's like great. But part of the thing that is obvious when you read it is it's obvious that she knows what she's talking about.
Right.
And she knows the original story very well, because when I say, so one of my point with fan fiction pulling things out is and understanding like the original source material is it does understand the original source material. It does take into account the context in which the other one was written. So when I say that it centers, for example, not that one, but like Circe centers the character of Circe, it doesn't mean that you have to change the story to make the character different. It just means, or the context different necessarily. It just means you can see something about why the character was written that way. It's a different point of view. It's like, I can understand why this character was written this way by the people it was written this way by, but what does that tell us? So Medusa, sorry, that's the one I was trying to think of. I think I think it's called Stone Blind or something, that centers Medusa as the main character of that story. And I think what I've heard about it is that it understands very well why Medusa existed as that character at the time that story was being told, and what that reveals about certain anxieties people at that time had about women, for example. And so by centering Medusa with that context in mind, you can actually explore why that idea would have been damaging even to people at the time, and how that would have impacted people. And so you cannot correct it, but when you're reading it now with that story already kind of in your head, you can think about what was perhaps wrong with that, or not necessarily wrong, but how that could impact a reader or consumer of that story.
I've got three things to follow that up with. One, I think you read Grendel.
Yes.
Okay, that's taking a character from where they're a secondary character and making them the primary character.
Yes.
That's an interesting parallel to what you're talking about. Another thing, I think I read these 3 books to you when you and Finnegan were little. Shakespeare Stealer.
Yes.
And a couple of other ones. In my memory, it was like there's a boy who is set up to transcribe a Shakespeare play so this other guy can steal it. So it's getting into a lot of details of Shakespeare's time. Even though it's a kid's book, it's revealing like, okay, there was, speed writing was going on. I think that's probably true. This is very valuable for this kind of issue. He said, I think he invented the term quilt quotation. I'd never heard it before.
Oh.
And he said a quilt quotation is when he said, normally if you're reading a quotation from somebody and it says da 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 dot 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 and then continues, he said somebody edited the quote for simple continuity and took out some stuff that would have just lengthened it unnecessarily. And we're trusting that the continuity of meaning has not been jeopardized. So he's saying Popper and other people have done this. He said, we'll take part of a quotation, dot, 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 stitch in something else that's nothing to do with this direct relationship and continue. And then Kaufman, to show his point, gives a quilted quotation from the Bible, from the New Testament, making the New Testament sound bloodthirsty and bizarre. And he's going, that doesn't really sit well with you, does it? Because it's not a fair representation of what was actually said. So to me, that's an issue related to our subject, because abridgment and adaptation run the risk of falsely representing something that they're not doing an adequate job of.
Certainly. And I think that actually directly goes into what I was saying. We're on a wavelength, because what I was going to bring up. No, I almost. But what I was going to bring up actually was very, very closely connected to this idea, which is taking, I think this happens quite a lot, and it's very popular right now specifically, but taking Greek myths and writing something with that as a modern author, and wrapping a novel or a film or a series or something around it. So you've got like the Percy Jackson series wraps itself around Greek mythology. The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller obviously like draws from not Greek mythology, but like ancient Greek storytelling, right? So I think that definitely connects to what you're talking about, because depending on how you do that, you may or may not be representing the story correctly in terms of its original context. Like, I think we both agree, for example, that it was a bit of a lazy misplay in the Hercules Disney cartoon to have him praying like that, because you could have used it as an opportunity to not raise awareness of, it's not like cancer or something, but like, to make the viewers aware that there might be another way to represent that idea. But I think that it is an interesting question, because it's like, to what degree is that adapting a specific story versus branching away from that to make sense of a new context? Now, I understand that's not the point of the quote you were reading, which was like how people can misrepresent through adaptation and original, I guess, text. But I would complicate that by adding that maybe that's not always the point. You know what I mean? Like the Percy Jackson series wasn't trying to introduce necessarily kids to the correct or original Greek stories. It was using that world as a springboard to tell totally different stories, even though that muddies certain representations of certain original Greek mythic characters.
And I think he was trying to exercise a certain humor and creativity in finding a modern avenue for the different aspects of the classical like another thing, there was a TV series from Gaiman. What's it? Somebody Gaiman?
Oh, Neil Gaiman. Are you talking about Good Omens?
Yeah, American Gods.
Oh, American Gods. Yeah. I've read the book and I've seen most of the series.
Okay, well, we watched 2 or 3 seasons of the series, but we didn't watch the whole thing. But in the concept of the newer gods, there was a very creative use of like television screens and electricity or something, to show like how you could bend or manipulate contemporary something to serve as the attributes or the power of a modern version of mythology. You know what I mean? I think it was very creative to do that. And then also bring into the present gods from the past who are now just bumbling around, seemingly not the heroic, berobed and, whatever,
Mm.
floating around. It was very clever, I thought,
I
by Galen.
agree. Yeah.
So yeah, there are ways to do that. And I think Riordan deserves the credit for introducing the concept of mythology and ancient lore to kids who might pursue that beyond his books once they've read them. Finnegan was interested. Of
Oh
course,
yeah, he really liked them. And I well, the reason I'm bringing it up sort of is to say somewhat contrary to the well, I mean, it's not contrary to, but sort of sideways from the point that of the quote that you were talking about. But I would say like sometimes changing the story is the point. Sometimes like misrepresenting the original is the point, I guess. Like not in a nefarious sense, but in the sense that like maybe the original isn't relevant anymore. Or it's not relevant to the point you want to make with it. Like with the reason I'm bringing this up is because to be fair, I didn't even really like this that much, as you know, but I think that when Madeline Miller sat down to write the Song of Achilles, she was thinking, I think there are aspects of this original story that are not relevant anymore or are even damaging or problematic in our modern understanding of things like masculinity and warfare and things like that. And so she was saying like, I see something in the original story that could actually be reworked to tell a more modern tale. And like I said, there I had issues with her book that had nothing to do with the adaptive part of it, which I think was successful. I guess is my point. Is that like in some ways she's not saying we should throw out the Iliad, but she's saying like, you know, maybe this age needs a different version of Achilles. Maybe that we just don't need that version anymore. Maybe that's not
my,
relevant now.
yeah, my question mark would be um, a, a sad but true thing is the winners of a war write the history books.
Yeah.
And so in the course of time, women and minorities and all kinds of situations have been bad for people that shouldn't have been bad for since the beginning of history or whatever,
Yeah.
since Adam and Eve for that matter. But anyway, I guess my point is I like people going back and trying to unearth. Well, here's a simple example. There's a
Mm.
woman named something off Clint. I can't think of her first name, but it's a whatever culture. It's like her middle part is AF
Mm-hmm.
something space AF space Clint KLINT. Not
Uh,
like she's an
uh-huh.
artist and she's kind of made a big splash recently. I mean, she's dead, but
Yeah.
big splash was bringing her forward and saying she was creating abstract art before anyone else we know of, before Kandinsky, blah blah blah. So
Mm-hmm.
they're trying to resurrect a fact that was overlooked to correct history. So and I mean, you could say, well, it's going to be hard going to find a woman who ran a country back then, or that's
Yeah.
true. But I'm a little uncomfortable about the idea of saying let's pretend history was otherwise and
I
insert a happy thing or a better thing. Like there's a lot of movies set in Victorian era or
mm,
whatever it is with a black man as the hero.
mm,
And I'm my history isn't that super duper. I would I would love to see a true representation of when those kinds of circumstances occurred. They're very valuable to help redress an imbalance, but
yeah.
I don't want them to be fake. You see what I'm
Okay,
saying?
so yeah, I do understand what you're saying, and I think we can draw a distinction between these two things because I think we're not quite talking about the same thing. Because I 1,000% agree with you and what you're talking about with this because it's untrue. of those certain circumstances. And I think that, as you said, it would be really valuable actually to adapt history more faithfully onto film in that sense. It was kind of similar actually to a critique, speaking of adaptation, that is relevant to what you're saying. I think I've told you about this before, but I think we've talked about this on the podcast before, but there was this person on Tumblr who was critiquing the critique of making Spider-Man, no, not Spider-Man, Batman. I guess there was some discussion of casting Batman with a black actor, or making a cartoon where he was black or something. And she was talking about, and I believe it wouldn't matter really for her point, but I think she was black writing about this. And she was saying, I think that would be really cool as long as they don't just slap a darker coat of paint on a white character, not because that is inherently bad, but because things about that character would have to change to make sense of this new identity. She's like, what would it mean for this rich businessman to be black? How would that change his interactions with the society that he exists within? Because we know that that makes a difference. And that could be really interesting, but you would have to change the story to be a black story, which would make it different, which is
of this character.
Right. So, but what I think is not what I'm talking about when I talk about like Madeline Miller. And again, I'm not dying on the hill of that book because I had issues with it, but like that actually had to do with the way she adapted it. But like, I think those types of things exist not to erase the originals, but in fact to kind of build on top of them, because like you were saying, or I guess mom said or something, we have this kind of general cultural consciousness that the Iliad exists within, even though if you asked 100 people, depending on how you pulled them, I don't even know how many of them would have read the Iliad, or what even version of the Iliad they would have read if you want to get into translation as a form of adaptation. But like they kind of know that story somewhat, somehow, the story of Troy, right?
There's a cultural element to that story that's part of our cultural heritage or whatever.
Correct. Yeah, cultural heritage. That's the word I'm looking for. So thank you. And I think that when we see adaptations like that and the popularity of this, like right now, there's this renaissance sort of an interest in Greek myths, but being retold by modern authors. I think there's this misunderstanding somewhat of what they're doing, because a lot of them, for instance, not the Song of Achilles because of what it is, but there are others, and even her other famous popular book, Circe, does this, but they're taking female characters from Greek mythology and centering them as the main character, as opposed to the context of their original stories where they would have been like side characters or just not fully like fleshed out, or just kind of existing for plot devices. And I think that's really interesting, because I think a lot of the blowback against those by some people is this idea that it's sort of being PC, or it's like woke, or it's erasing or critiquing, or like trying to take away the originals. And I'm like, I think they're just, they exist side by side. But I think what they are, the reason they're popular and the reason I think so many people feel spoken to by them is because they do like the story. They just don't necessarily see themselves in that original story, or more to the point of like what the worth of something like this is. They're just pulling something else out of it. I don't think you would write a story like that if you didn't have an immense amount of love and respect for where it came from. But I think they see, it's sort of like what I was saying, is like, what does each medium do well? If you want to consider, which some people might not, something like The Song of Achilles or Circe by Madeline Miller as fan fiction, what does fan fiction do well as a medium that can be a strength? What can you do with it that makes a story stronger in that medium? And I think one of the things that it does well, that is a good thing to do with it in this medium, is its ability to pull small threads out of things and make them bigger, and make them the focus. And in that way, I see them as enhancing original texts, not necessarily existing as a means of getting rid of them. if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess you would be on, let's say you're in a, I guess if yeah, I don't have any objection to that, but I guess I'm not sure where that stands in, like, if you're studying ancient Greece,
Mm.
you're going to be in a culture where slaves exist and women
Yeah.
are secondary characters. I presume. I'm no expert in that
Well,
area.
and that's what I'm trying to say is that
In
I think
reality, yeah,
for something to be considered a good adaptation, like we talked about, I think there has to be truthful elements to it, but also keeping in mind the strength of the medium. So, like, for instance, in the Song of Achilles, and I wish I could think of or had read some of these other ones that might be better than that one. I don't really like that one that much. I think it's fine, but I don't think it's like great. But part of the thing that is obvious when you read it is it's obvious that she knows what she's talking about.
right.
And she knows the original story very well, because when I say, oh, so one of my point with fan fiction pulling things out is and understanding like the original source material is it does understand the original source material. It does take into account the context in which the other one was written. So when I say that it centers, for example, not that one, but like Circe centers the character of Circe, it doesn't mean that you have to change the story to make the character different. It just
Okay.
means, or the context different necessarily. It just means you can see something about why the
A
character was
different point
written
of
that
view.
way.
A
Yeah,
different
it's
point
a
of view.
different point of view. It's like I can understand why this character was written this way by the people it was written this way by, but what does that tell us? So Medusa, sorry, that's the one I was trying to think of. I think I think it's called Stone Blind or something,
Okay.
that centers Medusa as the main character of that story. And I
Okay.
think what I've heard about it is that it understands very well why Medusa existed as that character at the time that story was being told, and what
That's
that reveals about certain anxieties people at that time had about women, for example. And so by centering Medusa with that context in mind, you can actually explore why that idea would have been damaging even to people at the time and how that would have impacted people. And so you cannot correct it, but when you're reading it now with that story already kind of in your head, you can
right.
think about what was perhaps wrong with that, or not necessarily wrong, but how that could impact a reader or consumer of that story.
I've got three things
Yeah.
to follow that up with. One, I think you read Grendel.
Yes.
Okay, that's taking a character from where they're a secondary character and making them the primary character.
Yes.
That's an interesting parallel to what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing, I think I read these three books to you when you and Finnegan were little. Shakespeare Stealer
Yes.
and a couple of other ones. In my memory, it was like there's a boy who is set up to transcribe a Shakespeare play so this other guy can steal it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's getting into a lot of details of Shakespeare's time, even though it's a kid's book.
Mm-hmm.
It's revealing like, okay, there was, speed writing was going on. I think that's probably true. The kid winds up joining the Shakespeare troupe, at which point he meets another kid who's
Mm-hmm.
in the troupe, who turns out to be a girl who's not
Mm-hmm.
supposed to, as a girl, be in it. So that
Mm-hmm.
was highlighting the fact that the girl was not acceptable, but she posed as a boy and did it anyway.
Yes.
Not to go, okay, let men run the show, and then if a girl can sneak in there, that's fine. They're going, no, they're just talking about the real thing of that time and making a story that's made up but elaborates information about that time that it gets a better picture. We have a different opinion about whether the girl should be in there or not. She should be fine. Why does it matter? What the hell is the matter with those people?
Well,
But
I was going to say that's what I'm talking about, because is that not a critique of that system by having that girl character? Because like I think to me when I think about those books, and again not to get too in the weeds if you haven't read the books, but by including her as but I think it was imperative that the story be written for her to have it revealed that she's a woman after being a successful actor in the troupe, because that that is the demonstration of
It
how
proves the
absurd
point.
that
Right,
rule
right.
was,
No,
right?
I agree with you. I think my original, if you think I
Yeah,
misunderstood, I think I did at the
yeah,
beginning about Cersei or whatever.
yeah,
Though they were saying like, hey, let's throw out Homer because that's all old-fashioned bullshit about men being in charge of everything, and let's substitute this, and people can grow up reading this and not
yeah.
bother with the other one. Whereas I think you're saying the other one remains a cultural
Touchstone. Yeah.
benchmark, and this is a way of illuminating parts of that society that are in the dark
Yes.
to us unless somebody illuminates them for us.
Or that we take for granted. You're right.
Right.
Like, for instance, with Medusa, I think that's an interesting example because I think we sort of just take for granted, like, we don't even think about Medusa person. You just think of, like, oh, yeah, this is like a thing that he has to overcome. And, like, oh, yeah, like, when you look at her, you turn to stone and she has
Yeah.
the snake hair. And what you don't even really think of, like, well, why was that her power? What does that tell us about what was going on in society at the time, that was scary as an idea to them? Or like the snake hair, like what do snakes represent to us, and what is the significance of the fact that this character is a woman, if there is any?
Right.
And
Right.
I think that there was, I really strongly want to say it was also Jack Edwards, but somebody on BookTube made a review of that story, which is the only reason I have it in my head, where they made, I think, a really good argument as to that the author of this modern version of that story also makes as to why it was relevant that she was a female uh, antagonist and not a man, and
Right.
that she couldn't have been a man because of the all of the cultural baggage associated with women at the
Yeah.
time. That
Yeah.
sometimes is still viewed that way today. That like women are, that the idea of a woman is the thing that petrifies the masculine man. Like he gets distracted, and that's what her turning them to stone was kind of alluding to, this idea that you take this like virile man who then is distracted by a woman and kind of turned to stone. Like he's no longer as effective as a man because he's distracted by women,
Right.
like that kind of thing. And that when you have her as the main character, you can get into that a little bit more easily.
Yeah. No, I would say I would appreciate it if I knew that the person who was coming up with this
Mm.
stuff had some background knowledge, research,
Yeah.
expertise in Greek culture and
Mm-hmm.
mythology or whatever. You know what I mean?
Oh
So yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that also kind of is just kind of on the reader, right? Like, I mean, everything that gets produced is like going to fall into one of like three tiers: really bad, kind of mediocre and okay. I guess it's four tiers: good and iconic,
Okay. You
right?
mean
And
you
so
mean
I think
books or
most
movies or
things, huh?
yeah, books or movies? Were you talking about?
Anything,
Oh,
any type
okay.
of art that's produced, I
Okay.
think is kind of going to
Okay.
be falling into one of those four categories. And I think we just, by sheer numbers, I think most things that get produced are going to be mediocre or really bad.
Yeah.
That's just the way it is, right? Because of how much is produced of anything at any given time. But like, I think the ones that stand up are going to be the ones that are good or iconic, right?
Yeah. I think
So
actually, the publishing industry falls into that issue with
yeah,
producing X number of books in a season, like you were, you had 12 fishermen on the dock, and like
yeah,
at least a couple of them are going to catch a fish. So it's sort of like
yeah.
something will hit the public, and if we're lucky, it'll be a runaway bestseller, and then we can just pulp. The bottom five of all these books just get thrown away after a while.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, a quote actually, I wouldn't subject you to this. I will link it in the card, but like um another YouTuber that I have a lot of respect for is Sarah Z, like, or in American English, Sarah Z, just the letter Z. And she does videos similar to Lindsay Ellis, but she tends to focus more on pop cultural topics.
okay,
Um, but anyway, but she did this like hour and a half long essay about it. I think she called it a definitive defense of fan fiction or something like that.
okay,
And one of the things that she used as like an image that I think is pertinent to what we're talking about, and I think she used very effectively, was your photograph is a shitty painting, when talking about adaptation and fan fiction versus published fiction specifically, but I think that's just such a perfect way to encapsulate a lot of how I feel about what goes wrong with specifically book to film adaptations. But I think in a lot of what we're talking about, that fault, that is sort of the problem, is we're judging the thing based on a medium that it isn't, or
Yeah.
the medium that it's trying to emulate, and therefore not doing a very good job, right?
Right. Yeah. I guess that is the question of like, are you like, okay, here's the thing. I've, I used to attack, at translator, what's his name?
Oh, Stephen Mitchell.
Okay. It is Stephen. Okay. Stephen Mitchell. Um, I ran across, I was surprised, trying to think, it was I don't remember now who it was. It was a German writer. It might have been, I think it was Rilke.
Mm.
And there was this overwhelming appreciation of his translation. Now, in this case, I'll grant that probably Stephen Mitchell knows German, is my suspicion. If he doesn't, that's pretty bizarre. But I still question this idea of like, oh, I can translate a Tibetan book and a
Oh yeah.
African book, and everything, Chinese doesn't matter. I can do anything. But um, on some of them, the phrase "to recreate" solves my problem in a way.
Yes.
And a lot of the transformation of something into something else is a recreation.
Yes.
So they're sort of saying, I understand. This brings up what you said earlier. Basically, I understand the core meanings of this work, and I'm going to translate them or recreate them
Mm-hmm.
in another medium to the best of my ability.
Yeah.
So, like we said, with a really good filmmaker, they know what's possible in film probably better than the average director, or the what do you flunky director from
Yeah.
some, and they chose this work in particular. They didn't just go, I'm a great director, throw anything at me and I will make
Mm-hmm.
a great film of it. They said, I want to do that because I have a vision of how to do it. So I think that's where great directors come from, like let's say Martin Scorsese or something,
Mm-hmm.
Robert Altman, perhaps, or different people, whether, especially if they have done adaptations, I'm more inclined to believe that they could turn it into something worth having done
Mm-hmm.
than the person who just says, this is a really hot book, we need to make a movie of it,
Yeah.
which I think happens over and over again.
Yes, it does. I agree. And I think that I really like the word recreate as well, because I think it gives a little bit more gravitas, I think, to that skill, which I was actually going to say, to kind of not be so down on this idea of adaptation, because I think there is a tendency, even for myself, to view it skeptically. But I think viewing it as an art form in and of itself, I think, is actually a valuable way to think of it. And I think recreate does give me more of that flavor, because I think it comes back to what I was trying to get to when I was bringing up this idea of like why I think certain book to film adaptations result in the film being the primary avenue through which a person gets that story versus the book. Like Silence of the Lambs, I think, versus, let's say, The Picture of Dorian Gray, I think are really good examples of this, because I think that the director of Silence of the Lambs is just a really freaking good director, because they really understand the medium that they're working with. They're a master of the medium that they're working with. And so they can look at something that's not in their medium and they can immediately see, this will work really well. This would be
Right,
awesome. This
right.
would be great. Same with, and I, again, sorry, Stephen King, but like the Stanley Kubrick The Shining adaptation is iconic, like, because he understands the medium of film so well. He, like, when you think of that, you think of the here's Johnny, you think of the blood like going through the corridor, the twins standing at the
Oh,
end of the,
yeah, yeah,
because those are such good images that really
right.
do evoke the exact things that
And
you want to get out of
they're
that
all
story.
stronger visually than they can possibly be in description.
And not only that, but like he's just, perhaps when it came to that story, Stanley again, sorry, Stephen King, but like maybe he just was a better director and a better master of film than Stephen King in that particular instance was of the written medium. That was just what happened. And I think with the Silence of the Lambs, I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case, right? And same with like Dracula. I think that that director, whoever did that version of that movie, was just a better director than Bram Stoker was an author, is possibly what happened. And we just haven't had that with, for example, with The Picture of Dorian Gray. Maybe there has not been a director who was a better director than he was an author to have that supersede. Same with, like you were saying, with Moby Dick.
Yeah.
Why is it that when you say Moby Dick, people are like, oh yeah, the book that I've never read, but it's really long and it's about the whale and I kind of know the story. You don't have a specific image of a movie because there has been no director who was able to be better at that medium than he was as an author. I think that's that. Same with like
Jaws.
yeah, Jaws. No, perfect example, right? Like that. Oh, that's such a famous director too.
I don't even remember. Spielberg? No.
Might be Spielberg. Anyway, like let's say Spielberg, I'll give him the credit for this. But like if he was just a better director than Peter Benchley was as an author, that would be the reason why that film would supersede. I don't think it's because people are just like, oh, we're a visual culture. I really don't think so, because there are too many examples where that's not the case.
That's a good point too, because I don't know who directed Silence of the Lambs. I don't think it's as
Let's
big a
find
name
out.
as Scorsese and Spielberg and that kind of thing. But I'm thinking that the big
No.
names that we revere as brilliant film directors, not necessarily like, oh, that's the most entertaining movie I've seen this week, but brilliant, like memorable. It's, it's hard not to say something like of literary quality or something, a masterpiece or
We
whatever.
need that word for film, though, I think.
Right. They might say it's a masterpiece or
Yeah.
whatever, but it tends to be, I think, that directors of that level are comparable to authors of that level. They probably tend not to step on each other's toes. In other words,
Yeah.
the brilliant directors are probably not going to say, I can do better than Melville did. Let me fix that book. You know what I mean? They're probably going to say, I'm not going to touch that. I mean, this is just my
Yeah.
own appointment of who's where. But to say that these directors make of whatever material they choose brilliant films that really can endure as film, the odds of it being, I mean, I don't know, somebody famous probably did The Great Gatsby. Might have even
The
been
more
Scorsese.
recent one
Yeah,
with DiCaprio.
yeah, there's that one, and then there's somebody else did another one even after that, but I think an unknown in that case. But at any rate, my bet would be the best brilliant films are not from super literary mountaintops. Like let's say 2001, Kubrick also, you go from a science fiction novel that was, a big thing in its day. And it's like, now I think people would be more likely to watch the film than read the book, perhaps.
Yeah. And again, I think, and in a way, it kind of salves my inner weird feeling about people who talk about, oh, I never read the book, because I think it makes me feel more like maybe it really depends on the book. And maybe it really depends on the movie. Because certainly, for instance, I don't care that I have never and probably will never read The Silence of the Lambs, because I just don't feel like it'll be better than what the director, by the way, I did look up who the director was. Just, it's Jonathan Demme. I don't think, which you're right, is not one of it, but brilliant.
No, I do know of him. I know he's, like a name director, but not at the stature of Kubrick and Scorsese, for example. But,
right. So it really makes me feel better, I think, at the end of this conversation about the idea that I don't think it is necessarily the fact that movies have a tendency to overshadow books, because I think we've proven that's not always or even usually true. But I think it just really depends on the skill of the director.
Right.
And also it might speak to an extent how good the original source material actually was or wasn't. For instance, I think it's interesting actually that with Harry Potter, to an extent, the films not overshadowed the books, but they're considered kind of,
Mm.
like the performances of certain actors in those films considered kind of definitive, right? And
Yeah,
I
yeah.
would say, instead of saying, wow, I hate it when books overshadow my enjoyment of, or the movies overshadow my ability to interpret the book by itself, I'm like, maybe that says more about the quality of the original source material and the skill of the director of the visual one, actually,
Right, right.
to an extent. Like that doesn't take away your point of saying, like, well, I don't want to have to picture Daniel Radcliffe every time I read Harry Potter, or I don't want to picture whoever. And I think that still remains a true critique. But it also makes me want to think about it differently when I have that reaction and think, does this mean that the book was maybe less good as a book than this is than this is good as a film? Maybe that is
Well,
actually the truth
well, the other
sometimes.
thing, I'm still sticking with my theory, and it's only a
Yeah.
theory, that if I read Moby Dick or
Mm,
whatever 30 years ago or something,
mm,
and I have these movies stuck in my head, if I started to reread the book, I think it would take me away from the movies and I would go into it. Whereas I'm probably never going to reread the Harry Potter books. I read them, I've seen the movies. If I ever wanted the experience again, I'd probably lean toward the movies
And
for
I
simplicity's
think
sake.
that's so interesting, though, because I think that says a lot about the source material, actually, that I think a lot of people would agree with you. A lot of people would say, books, whatever. But
Right.
like,
I think,
I think it says something.
well, I would add this though, about what I just said.
Mm,
If I had the opportunity to read to kids of the right age,
yeah.
I would love to read the Harry Potter books or
Hmm.
something else that would really ignite their imaginations, rather than just go, never mind, just go see the movie. Because such a fan of books that I want
Hmm.
people to be hooked on books.
No, that's true. But I think that illuminates something interesting about a certain aspect of quality control that I never really thought about before. It just does. Because, like, for instance, with Harry Potter, it's like if you, I mean, again, I'll bring it up every time, but like if you think about Jonathan Stroud's The Bartimaeus trilogy,
Right.
first of all, I'm kind of glad there's no film adaptation because I'm not confident that there's anybody who would be a better director than he was a writer to pull that story. But however, I just mean, like, maybe that's a good reason why Harry Potter, the books, don't have to endure, because the films maybe were just better, or like, or at least on par with, and like you said, take less time to watch than it is to read. But I thought it was so interesting that you said it takes like longer time to read the books than to watch the movie. And I'm like, well, isn't that illuminating about the value of that story though? Because I would not probably watch a film adaptation of A Picture of Dorian Gray before I would reread the book, because the story is sort of, it has to be written to be
Right.
like,
Right.
that's part of
Well,
the point.
right. I agree. And Harry Potter is certainly not a literary masterpiece to me, but it
No.
would be a wonderful experience for a kid of the right age,
No, but
to
my point
appreciate.
being is that, like,
Yeah.
if that's how you feel about it, as proven by the existence of the movies, it almost
Right.
feels like that would be the excuse to not pick those and to pick something that hasn't been done successfully for you.
Okay.
Like for instance, the Bartimaeus
Yeah.
trilogy,
Yeah. That was
or
a fantastic series. Well, let's say Pullman, whom I put up
yeah,
there
yeah,
at
yeah. I was
least
just
as
about to
high as
say that.
Proud.
Yeah.
They have tried to make the
Mm-hmm.
movies. The second shot at it worked out somewhat better than the first
Mm-hmm.
one, but not to the level, in my opinion, of the books.
Which to me would be like, so if I'm sitting down to choose something to read for a kid and I'm like, okay, there are two versions of this, I've experienced both in both mediums, this is a better story, because I wouldn't say that it would be even remotely comparable to read versus watch this, versus like something like Harry Potter, where you might actually be like, all things considered, maybe I only thought that you should read the books instead of watching the movies because I just think books are better generally. But maybe in that case, that's not true,
Yeah, I could see
actually.
I could see that. And there's also, well, there is the element of, depending on how you remember the Harry Potter books in extraordinary detail. I
Yeah.
could just, for example, with Tolkien,
Yeah.
in
Another
the
one.
movies, as elaborate as they are, and they actually added material,
Hmm.
notes, or something else that Tolkien wrote, but they skipped entire things that were not super consequential. It didn't hurt the story to pull out this character named Tom Bombadil,
Mm.
who is just this lighthearted character that's in a little sequence in there. You'd go, if you don't read the book, you'll never run across Tom Bombadil. If you watch the movie, you'll be excited. It'll be wonderful,
Mm.
but it's not everything that the book is, no matter how you cut it. And that's
Sure.
true.
Yeah.
It's actually true with Harry Potter also, but I guess it's also true, and this is maybe my fear, is it a changing culture where the number of people who are bookies versus videoies is shifting toward the video end.
But that's what I'm saying, though, is I think that that's a fear that I also have entertained, but I don't actually, now that we've literally just been in the course of this conversation, I actually think I've talked myself out of that because of all of the examples of classics we can come up with really easily, that they are more enduring than any film adaptations, even if there have been multiple film adaptations like Moby Dick. Like Moby Dick as a cultural touchstone is still very much tied to the fact that it's a book, even though there have been at least two, probably, film adaptations. I think one of them was even a cartoon. So like those were not good enough to supersede the book, whereas something like maybe Dracula, the film was good enough to supersede the
Yeah,
book, and that's okay.
Well, my only fear is, but how many people read Moby Dick in the
Well,
world we live in
but
now?
I mean, my point would also be, but how many people saw the movie? you
Well,
know?
if they made another one now, and
Yeah.
they put out the book with a picture from
Mm-hmm.
the movie, the book might sell, and
Yep.
then shitloads of them would get donated to the library in mint condition.
True, but here's my point though with this, and I think where I am a little bit maybe more optimistic than you, like to me, the way I view it, and I think this is somewhat influenced, which is why you should listen to it, by the ghostwriter video that Jack Edwards put out. Because to me, it's sort of like, what is the outcome that I want? The outcome that I want is for people to read books and to read good books. That's like what I want, right? And I think to me, there's no, how do I put this? Like if they made a film adaptation just now, like next year, of Moby Dick, and they put it out and it was like star-studded cast, but it wasn't definitive. Let's say it was just adequate, right? Like it just was fine. It was sufficient, but it
An
wasn't like,
adventure flick.
yeah, but it wasn't better than the book, let's say, the way we're talking about maybe how Dracula was. It's not. It's just mediocre. It's whatever. It's going to fade into obscurity. Nobody's going to care about it in 20 years or even remember that it existed. Okay, let's just say that that's true. I think, though, that the point of it somewhat could still be to
Remind people of the book.
remind people of this other cultural touchstone, so that even if for the most part people aren't reading it, like I haven't read it but I still kind of know the story, right? Like it endures through these failed sort of attempts to supersede it in a way, so that like it does survive, because there are going to be, even if it's not a big number, some people who will read it as a result of that shitty film adaptation.
You're
And
right.
I
That's
think
true.
that those are the people that matter in terms of propelling it forward as a cultural touchstone. So to that end, I don't think it's damaging when that happens per se. But I still understand, like, as from the perspective as a person like you who have read and love the book, to be like, just read the book, it's better. But like, frankly speaking, most people wouldn't read it anyway, but some people might, and it might be actually easier if it's kind of recent in the cultural consciousness that it even exists to make that pitch.
That's true. It's very true that it revives knowledge of the thing
Mm-hmm.
at the minimum.
Even if it sucks, to be honest, I think it does have that benefit. However, bringing it all the way back around, I think that it would still have a shitty cover, and we need to work on that.
The whale.
That really, I mean, what else do you need? But that, I mean, I haven't read it, so maybe there's a better visual. But like,
They would have to have. I think I can almost picture in my mind a cover of a paperback from when I was in high school of Moby Dick. I didn't read it then, but I remember maybe Mike had it or something. But it's got the Ahab character, you know, in the fort. You see part of his face on standing on a ship or something, and you see the whale in the background of the scene. To say like that tells you everything you need. There's this guy and there's this whale, and read the book. You know.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I just for to reassure anybody and sort of prove my point. Another couple that I can say right off the cuff that I know have had a film adaptation that just did not supersede the cultural touchstone of the written one was Lord of the Flies. Would be another one. I know there's a film adaptation. I know
there are two movies of that. Yeah.
But like again,
yeah.
Nope, that's not the cultural touchstone. I couldn't even, if you showed me a still, maybe I could guess because I know the book. But like that's one where I would say, no, never been a film adaptation that superseded the book. 1984, never been an adaptation that superseded the book ever. And I don't think it's because it's impossible, but I don't think there's been a director yet who has been a better director than they were authors, period. Animal Farm, I guess it's the same author, so that's cheating. But like, you know, those types of things. Whereas, for instance, the Halloween Tree, even though I do think it's a good story, especially if you already like Ray Bradbury, even he, in his intimate involvement with the production of the cartoon, recognized, I think, that that was the better medium for this story.
Or at the minimum, he gave his imprimatur so that the reader can go, Bradbury's very content with this version, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, not that you need that, but if you wanted to challenge it somehow, you'd go, hey, the man who wrote the book is perfectly content with this movie. Let alone you and I saw it and liked it a lot.
He felt like the director of that cartoon had him beat. He was like, he did this better. It was a better medium for that story, and he was a better director than I was an author of this story. Maybe not in like in a general sense. Like I don't know if that director, I don't even know who the director
right. Or he might even just say, I'm content with having written it. It's not the most important thing in my life that I need to be remembered for. I mean, where I feel like, no, read the book. I'm very happy that it will reach more people, and I'm a participant in the making of it.
Yeah, and it kind of comes down to I do really think like the story in a way exists in a sort of nebulous liminary space, and it just kind of comes down to we have all these mediums to choose from. Who's going to do it, and is it going to be the best that it could have been or not? And if it's not, maybe somebody else will try again and they might do better, or maybe not. Do you have any final thoughts on the adaptation topic? You don't have to. It's not a requirement.
No, but I'm just looking. I had a ton of notes that I never even referred to. Okay, there's what just to try to be real brief. Reading criticism of a book is not, you know, it's a question of, is that going to, you know, hurt your enjoyment of the book if you read something first or not? To my mind, just to answer my own question, it would depend on the richness and complexity of the book you're about to enter, whether you might want a lead-in from a literary critic or a history reminder. If you're going to read a historical novel, you know, to just be up to speed on some issues to do with the time. Anyway, there might be a way in which getting a little nudge into the subject matter can be helpful before you read certain books, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I think I agree. And I even think I can fit that into adaptation very easily, because I think in a way it's sort of, I think that's actually interesting. We didn't really go into this, but something for people to take away maybe as a thought. But yeah, literary criticism as a type of adaptation is kind of an interesting lens to think of that through, actually.
Well, people, let's say here's a classic thing. There's a classic thing called the Norton Anthology.
Oh, yes.
Critical edition. So you read Scarlet Letter or whatever it is, and then the other half of the book is reviews from the time when it came out, other comments by Melville or Hawthorne about the book, and on and on, and then you work through a series of critics through time, the Marxist interpretation of Scarlet Letter, I mean, whatever, all these
Mm-hmm.
things that you may or may not wade all the way through, but they're available as they're really after the fact. So it's sort of the opposite, but it's like presumably helpful in you digesting what just happened to you.
Mm-hmm.
You read the book, and there might be ideas that can deepen your appreciation, or you could go, wow, I totally missed that. Just for a simple example, if you wrote an essay at the end of um, the Oscar Wilde book
Mm-hmm.
and pointed out the blonde hair
Mm-hmm.
matter as being relevant for this reason and critique the movie, in terms of that, that would be a neat little thing for somebody. You could go, well, let them incubate their own mind. Maybe they'll come up with it. I'd go, well, if they're just going, I like that book, but and then it might be an angle of thinking that is offered to you by a
Mm-hmm.
critical assessment that's interesting.
Yeah, I am flattered that I'm being recommended to anybody who's listening, who wants a person to write some kind of afterword for Dorian
There you
Gray.
go.
But I guess my final thoughts, it's kind of silly, but I think it summarizes sort of my overall opinion on this topic, um, which hilariously I think is going to not land on the book side of things. But I think a good way to summarize my feeling about this is I think it's a good thing, actually, and a logical thing, and it's better, actually, that we don't really need physical cookbooks anymore. Like,
Okay.
I think that the visual medium for recipes is better. And I think that my feeling about this is very much informed by what we talked about, in the sense that I think thinking about adaptation, not necessarily like being
Just fiction.
pitting two things against each other that have to be or should be considered equal competitors, but thinking if the point of storytelling or cooking is to do something entertaining or tasty, I'm okay with saying sometimes certain mediums are better than others for a specific purpose, even
I
if
totally, yeah,
even if I would still say in general I like the medium of the written word better than the
okay.
visuals of a film or a series. I do concede that sometimes I think they can be better, in the same way that
I,
I think of a video is better for cookbook
I,
for
I,
recipes than a
I,
cookbook for me.
I totally agree with that example. And I would add another one, and then I would give a
Mm,
general remark. Somebody once said, like, okay, students, describe a pair of scissors. And you
mm,
go, with your hands behind your back. Like you said, isn't it a lot easier to do this
mm,
or show a pair of scissors, how they
mhm,
work, rather than put into words the function and shape of a pair of scissors? In that vein, I'd say a recipe which involves doing a bunch of stuff is so much better uh, conveyed by somebody showing you how to do it,
mhm,
basically. The same with other practical jobs like repairing a toilet. Or so people go like, I had to do something in the engine of the car, or I was confused about how to put the battery back in the lawnmower because I obtusely thought that the small piece must be the battery, but
oh,
I was totally whacked out. But I wound up looking on YouTube and going, oh man, of course I get it because they could show me.
mhm.
If you're on the telephone, somebody, people describe something and you go, is that on my left side or where is that? They go, no, right here. So anyway, I totally
Yeah,
agree. And
I think that, oh, exactly what you just said. Like, oh, I see, I understand. I think that sometimes I forget that that's not the only point, but it is a point that literature is trying to make too. Like,
right,
oh, I understand something, I get something, I thought about something. And I think sometimes, not always, not even usually, but like sometimes it's okay if the film can do that better.
yeah,
Because at the end of the day,
I
I'd
think so.
rather the story exist in the medium that it belongs in best.
I think I like your litmus test, which is to say, if a film is made and it winds up being the cultural icon of that story, then the film was the preferred method of conveying it compared to
Mhm.
the. And I'm just arguing without any evidence that the more literary quality the book has, the less will a film ever be able to usurp its position.
I think it's a really good and interesting test for those books, in a way, because it really does. And I think this is especially clear if it's been attempted and failed multiple times or even one time. It does say something, I think, in favor of the book and the quality of it as a piece of art, where it
And
was just
sometimes,
so perfect for that medium that it has been unable to be replicated or certainly superseded in any other.
yeah, no, I could imagine too, because of the advances in CGI, is that the right word?
Mm,
That kind of thing, that somebody could try to make a movie of a certain book and it does not usurp the place of the book. But as CGI has perfected itself, even let's say the Pullman books, the
mm,
idea of a polar bear running around talking and gesticulating
yeah.
just as you want them to is handled amazingly well in these videos now. Whereas if somebody had made it right after the book came out, it would have been like kind of cheesy over time or whatever.
Hmm.
So I could see that there could be sometimes an attempt and a fail, and then all of a sudden a successful transition or translation
Yeah.
that takes over. But I'm still banking on the written word having its own unique features that when it's at its supreme level, it's not going to be usurped for its purpose in
Hmm.
another medium. It's going to
Yeah.
be a lesser work that gets glorified in another medium.
Yeah.
Is my
I
suspicion.
I I wouldn't be surprised if that were true. I really wouldn't. I mean, even thinking of some of the really well-regarded film adaptations of Shakespeare,
Yeah,
we still read Shakespeare, though.
yeah, he hasn't been kicked out yet.
No, not yet. Nobody has been a better director than he was a stage director yet.
Apparently
And
not.
and
But they,
it is interesting, though. It will be interesting if that ever is the case, because I just don't think that that's necessarily bad, but I think that will be very interesting
yeah,
if that were to happen, or with some of these other ones, like if there is a director who comes up, because film is a very new medium, I mean, relative to books,
yeah.
right?
Well,
So maybe it just hasn't had the time.
I wouldn't be surprised if Shakespeare slowly faded into the world of Chaucer. I mean,
Mm,
meaning, it's like it's a specialty thing only. People going to college, even in a literature class,
hmm.
wouldn't necessarily encounter Shakespeare anymore or in high school. And it will be left to film. And because the language will, they won't stick to Shakespeare if Shakespeare is pushing further into the past like that.
Mm,
They'll do West Side Story instead of Romeo and
yeah.
Juliet, and there'll be adaptations that carry that story forward, and Shakespeare winds up being a specialty thing
Mm,
and not so much of a cultural norm. Probably more people are aware of Shakespeare and can quote some stuff from Shakespeare than are aware of Chaucer or
yes.
Milton. I mean, if they, the name might ring a bell like Milton. I think I know something about Milton. They go, well, nobody reads Paradise Lost unless you're in a specialty literature class.
Yeah.
So,
And then they only really like the devil part,
yeah. Well, they
is what I,
say, yeah, the quote is Milton was of the devil's camp, but didn't know it.
yeah. Well, Um, I guess that's kind of where we can leave things. But for anybody watching, maybe there was something in there. I feel like we covered a lot of ground with this topic that's actually quite fertile ground, as a matter of fact. So we might have to return to this at a later point. But as always, it's really lovely talking to you about book stuff.
Very much enjoyed it too. I probably will look over my notes and maybe I'll try to write you an email if there's
Uh,
anything in there of interesting substance.
Sounds good.
Um, and
And
until next time,
we'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.
keep reading.
Keep reading.